Section 7 of Irish Idylls by Jane Barlow. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. Ody spoke with sincere conviction and a wonted authoritativeness, which did not fail to impress Stacey, and through many succeeding days she clung to the colour sergeant hypothesis as desperately as if it had been a life-buoy instead of a straw. In the long dark evenings, when it was too cold to lie down away from the fire on the puddly floor, and in the bleak mornings, when life walking up found naught the answer persistently elicited by computations of happiness in prospect, a result which 18 years old is prone to regard as a reductio ad impossibile, Stacey sometimes shut out intrusive despairs with the help of Ody's glowing picture. Only it invariably happened that the martial figure, flaring and glittering along the bog road, turned before he came very near into just Dan himself in his old scarecrow tatters, without any splendour or brilliancy at all. She had much need, in truth, of whatever cheering figments either faith or fancy could frame, for this winter was a pitiless season in Lisconnel and its inhabitants. One December night they all shivered sorely in their layers of heather and rags, as if the breath of a bitter frost were abroad. Still, in the morning, no traces of such were visible, unless you noticed that the lingering brier and bracken leaves seemed suddenly to have been dipped in fiery vivid scarlet and orange. But when the potatoes for the next meal were gathered, faces lengthened and heads shook, for experienced eyes at once recognised signs of a frost-biting that must entail a serious shrinkage of estimated supplies, and soon after that they began to draw omens from the flights of birds, flocks, mainly of seagulls, small and great, who came swooping over the murk of the bog, lighting on it in patches of foam, scattered momentarily in a flickering of white wings as they fled on further inland. Herons, too, passed heavily and gloomily flapping and croaking, and long trains of wild duck scudding by like trails of smoke that knew where it was going, till they dwindled into blurred pencil marks on the horizon. All these, if they did not exactly belong to the nation of unfortunate and fatal birds, were watched coming and going by foreboding eyes as the harbingers of powerful severe weather, when they do be that plinty. And sure enough, before Christmas there was deep snow. It came wavering across the bogland on a northwest wind, and lay strewn at first in handfuls and then in armfuls, till at last a huge lead-coloured cloud appeared to shatter itself sheer over Lisconnel, like as if, to quote Pat Ryan, you were crumbling a soft clod of clay between your two hands. And thenceforward all was one blank of white, only broken here and there by the black mouth of a bog hole. Even these filled eventually, as the water in them froze hard, and made of each a secret resting place for the whirling drifts, pitfalls into one of which the Quigley's fawn-coloured goat floundered down, poor wretch, to her smothering death. For the snow was accompanied by such a biting frost as seldom grips Lisconnel, and the tiny dry flakes and granules seemed to be ground fine and driven in tangible mists of stinging dust on the wide wailing storm. It's a good chanst we're getting to understand the sayin', when you see the snow like salt and mail, your food and fire be apt to fail. Brian Kilfoyle said one day, ruefully kicking at a glittering powdery drift which had sifted under the Doynes' rickety door into their house, where he was talking to Stacey and her mother. Brian, who is normally a big burly man at that time, had assumed, in common with his neighbours, the aspect of an incomplete structure, a framework with much filling out left to do. "It's 7 weeks lyin' on us now since Christmas, and here's Candlemas wid nary a sign of the change yit. But I'm glad to see you holdin' up so well again it, ma'am." "Och, indeed, I'm keepin' elegant and grand, thank God," said Mrs. Doyne, nervously fingering the largest hole in her frayed out apron. "But as for Stacey there, the cratur, her face this minute isn't the breadth of the palm of me hand. The two eyes of her'll presently be runnin' into one." Stacey shrank further into the background at the sound of her own name, and Brian Kilfoyle said, "Ah, sure, young things like her do be easy perished, aye, and the old people too. There's me poor mother, she and little Jim, since the bad turn he took a while ago, they don't seem to have an atom of warmth left in them. Scarce a wink they sleep at night wid the cold, though we do give them every rag we can contrive. Our hearts are fairly broke wid them. For me mother, if we don't mind her, will be slippin' the wisp of an old cloak off her onto one of the childer and gettin' her death. And that Jim does be creepin' from one to the other like a lost dog at a fair, tryin' for a taste of heat somewheres. The misfort'nit little spalpeen, his hands grabbin' you to be just dabs of ice, but divil a thraneen more have we got to put on them." There was a painful pause, and then Mrs. Doyne said apologetically, "I wish to goodness gracious, Brian, I could offer you the loan of e'er an old wrap, but indeed it's hard set we are, man, to keep the life from freezin' stiff in ourselves these times, wid the most we've got." To be sure, ma'am," Brian said in hurried deprecation. "How would you? Sure we must all shift for ourselves the best way we can, and we'll do right enough onst this blamed black frost quits a hold." Brian had now carried out the purpose of his call, but he could not betray the fact by immediate departure, so he lingered gossiping in the doorway. "Big Anne's sleepin' up at Widdy M'Gurk's these couple of nights back. Did you hear tell?" he began. "She got that scared and lonesome there be herself she couldn't abide it. For Mad Bell was, as we know, absent, and the dummy had been some years dead." "So they were sayin'," said Mrs. Doyne, "but look a Brian," lowering her voice solemnly, "div you know was there anything special frightened her?" "Well, yes," he answered in a reluctant sort of mumble, "a foot goin' up and down along be her door, and nobody on the road, and somethin' that shook the latch and let a keen, and never a breath of wind stirrin'. Leastwise that's the story she has. But just you tell me how many nights in the year there is widout a waft of wind goin' through it. And as for them bastes of goats, times and again I've mistook a one of them pattin' by for somethin' in brogues." Howsomever, what fairly terrified her was a voice that kept callin' "Anne, Big Anne," imitating first one neighbour and then another, and different in a manner from them all. She says 'twas such hijeous clare moonlight she dursn't look out, and she lay in a cold tremble till the mornin', listenin' to a tappin' on the window. She'd stopped up the pane wid her old saucepan lid, for 'fraid she might see somethin' that was rattlin' belike. "Saints shield us around," said Mrs. Doyne, crossing herself. "We'd be well put off if there was nothin' worse than saucepan rattlin'. You've heard tell what happened young Mick Ryan about Holy Eve, when he'd a crib set for snipe be the river?" Brian only said, "Aye, aye," uninvitingly, but she could not forego the recital. "Just lifted a basket he was, when he looked up, and if there wasn't one of them standin' on the opposite bank right front of him, wid only the flow of the bit of stream between them, and the other comin' jiggin' over along the strip of field not a stone's throw off. Troth, poor Mick thought he couldn't get his heels out of it fast enough. I wonder he didn't lose his wits for good. When he fetched home, his people thought he was blind drunk. Och, mercy, what it all's yon out there, Brian." She interrupted herself, suddenly clutching him by the arm and pointing through the open door. Far out upon the blanched waste something there was, moving dimly in the thickened light of the gloaming, but whether the form of man or beast, or of neither, could not be told. Brian, without speaking, went a step outside, and seemed to measure the distance which intervened between his own door and the place where he stood. "It's just merely one of the goats traipsing around," he said. Then he made a plunge and rushed towards his cabin across the clogging snow, stumbling and tripping in a headlong haste for which there was nothing apparent to account. Mrs. Doyne banged and bolted the door behind him, and when, long afterwards, her two sons came home, they were obliged to kick and shake it for some time, with much strong language uttered in unmistakably familiar tones, before courage enough was screwed up inside to give them admission. On the next morning, Mrs. Doyne, coming in with an icicle-fringed bucket, sustained another shock of a different kind. Stacey was sitting with folds of brown stuff spread about her, and with needle and thread in hand. It was the material got for her wedding gown, cut out by Biddy Ryan, who is queer and cute about such things, and partially sewn together by Stacey's mother before the day when the girl had passionately implored that it might be put away out of her sight, since when it was lain hidden underneath the dresser. "I was considerin' the skirt would make a little sort of frock like for the Kilfoyles' Jim," Stacey said in explanation. "'Tis bad to be thinkin' of the bit of an imp perishin' all night. Then the length of grey holland 'ud make a petticoat might help to keep the life in old Mrs. Kilfoyle. I'd be sorry anything took her." The old woman had soothed Stacey's spirit by expressing confidence in the honesty of Dan. "And there'll be enough wincy left yit to riddy up a body for your ugly old self." "Och, honey, but supposin' you might be wantin' it one of these days after all," said Mrs. Doyne, unable to refrain from a protest against this implied abandonment of hope. "Niver a want I'll want it," said Stacey. "He's dead and gone, Mother Jewel. 'Tis a sin to lave it lyin' up. There's a beautiful warmth in it, and I've set me mind on it uncommon." So Mrs. Doyne assented, as she would to most things upon which Stacey, with her great wistful eyes, had set her mind. This acquiescence, however, not barring sundry bitter thoughts of a Dan hypothetically in the land of the living. Stacey sewed hard all day, with horrible gobble stitches, it must be owned, for her education had been sadly neglected in many of its branches, besides which the cold would scarcely let her hold the needle. By the time the daylight failed, she had finished two very quaint garments, whose cut would not bear criticism, but warm and stout of fabric. She felt impatient to convey them to the Kilfoyles, yet as she looked out over the gleaming snow, which had drawn all the light down out of the blank sky, some uncanny thoughts came before her mind so vividly that she shrank from traversing even those few rods of ground alone, and she determined to wait until her brothers came in. But as the evening wore on and they did not arrive, she grew more and more fidgety. It would be a cruel pity to let Jim freeze through another whole night. His small cold hands seemed to keep dragging her towards the door, and at last she said to herself that she would chance it. Maybe there wasn't a word of truth in them quare stories all the while. She'd never seen aught. Watching her time, therefore, she stole out unobserved with her bundle into the moonlight. She wished it had not been so bright. Just to run on blindly through dark shadows, which kept discreetly hidden whatever unchancy objects they might hold, would have seemed easier than to face that broad white glare, where anything dreadful would be seen so very plainly. The rush was made, however, without incident, and then Stacey sped out of the Kilfoyles' cabin almost as precipitately as she had sped into it, running away from the bewildered gratitude of its inhabitants, and the importunate memories and contrasts which this final disposition of her wedding gear did not fail to arouse. But when she had gone only a few paces from their door, a sudden panic seized her. She was compelled by a sort of irresistible fascination to look fearfully round over the wilds that lay stark about and about her, as solitary as the unfathomed blue-black deeps, with their frost-burnished full moon and light-drowned star-flecks. Wafts of wind came murmuring from the far distance, here and there sweeping up a whirl of powdery flakes, as if some one lifted a corner of the great white sheet and let it fall again in a rumpled fold. The wind, of course, was full of sighs and voices, and shadows wavered and flitted on the snow. How could she tell what they might be? Suppose she should meet that strange little crying child, whom people said sometimes ran after them when they were late abroad on the bog, or the limping old woman who laughs in your face as she goes by. Terror whirled through Stacey's thoughts like an autumn gust among a drift of fallen leaves. She began to dart along as fast as the deep snow, a nightmare-like drag, would permit, and she kept her eyes fixed desperately on the track she trod in. Quite near her own door, however, she had to slacken her pace, because across her path stretched two furrow-shaped snowdrifts, into whose ungauged depths she dared not plunge her bare foot. And as she paused a moment irresolute, a voice close by spoke abruptly. "You'll have to get over them," it said, in standing leaps, as the devil went through Athlone. Stacey did not scream or fly, for she knew the voice, and it was one which would have reassured her in the teeth of a North American blizzard or the heart of a West Indian cyclone. "So it's yourself, Dan," she said. Dan O'Beirne it was, a tall, gaunt, ragged figure, standing up blackly just beyond the sharp-cut shadow of the Doynes' cabin wall. "Aye, 'tis so," he said, with an anxious hurry in his manner. "And are you thinking entirely too bad of me, Stacey, that I stayed away so long? And you not hearing a word, I'm told, except the letter I sent be Paddy Loughlin, the Strachawn that you never got? Meself it is, sure enough, and pounds and something I stopped to get you up at Larne, only there's the use of one hand mostly destroyed on me, and I don't know, tellin' you the truth, if I ever walk any better than a trifle lame wid me left foot. Just a trifle. Och, but Stacey, asthore, maybe you'd liefer have naught to say to such an old bosthoon of misery." "Sure it's all one," said Stacey, "why you stayed away, since it's home you are again, and the sorra o' much I'd be mindin' if you hadn't a hand or a foot left on you at all. A speech whereof the first clause sounds rather poor-spirited, and the last distinctly unfeeling, but to which Dan took no exception. He could give a more detailed account of himself, however, to less incurious friends, whom he told how, on finishing his engagement at the peat factory, a temptingly lucrative job had lured him over the straits to Scotland, whence he intended to return about Holy Eve, which change of plan he announced in a letter home, confided to one Paddy Loughlin, who proved an unreliable messenger. The truth is that Paddy Cliver and Clane forgot his friend's letter in his own bustle about transmitting his earnings home in postal orders, and getting himself shipped back as a pauper to the most conveniently situated union, a thrifty, if not strictly legitimate, mode of travelling occasionally adopted by itinerant harvest men. How just before he should have started for home, he met with a bad accident while helping to rescue the factory foreman's son out of a whirl of jag-toothed wheels and hissing bands, like so many spiders' webs all set a-going by the divil, and had lain for a couple of months crippled in hospital, whence he had sent no word, lest they be fretted thinking he was took for death away from them all. Uncommon kind people, ran his account of his experiences there, and everything done as agreeable as they could contrive, barrin' that them doctors would be looking in of a morning and saying, "That leg had a right to come off to morrow," or "He'll lose them 2 fingers anyway, as easy and pleasant as if the flesh wasn't creeping on your bones to hear them. But sure they were intendin' no harm. It's the nature of them to keep choppin' and sawin'. The only wonder is that any one gets out of a place where they do be plenty, wid enough of his body left to hold his soul in." Then how, recovering, unmulcted after all of limb, he had straightway repaired home, bringing with him the pounds and pounds presented to him by the grateful foreman, a suit of clothes much too good to think of wearing, and the promise of permanent employment at Sterry and Lawson's whenever he chose to return. Even so, Dan's homecoming could not be compared for external brilliancy with that of the colour sergeant. Indeed, after the first raptures of restoration had subsided, the elder Dan cast many a regretful glance at the halting gait and sling-suspended arm of his tall son, while Ody Rafferty sought to slur over the refutation of his own conjectures by insisting on the fact that if the lad had took off to the most outrageous wars ever was, he'd more likely than not have come out of them with less destruction done on him than might be perceived now. Young Dan's native air seemed, however, to possess very salubrious qualities, and before he had been 3 weeks at home, his step began to regain its firmness and strength, and suppleness returned to his limp wrist and stiffened fingers. His cure was practically complete by the time that the black frost had broken, and the snow had vanished off the bog, leaving only its wraith on the frail blossomed sloe bushes, and the wedding day had come. I met the bridal party proceeding towards the town on Farmer Hilferty's loaned jaunting car, and it struck me that I had never seen so many people at once on any vehicle. I caught a glimpse of Jim Kilfoyle in a queer brown frock, sitting on the well, and just as they passed he was saying sternly, "I declare, Biddy Sheridan, if you don't leave holding me on, I'll let the greatest old yell you ever heard and terrify the horse." This was a morning in Easter week, and Lady Day in spring too, a coincidence which led the widow M'Gurk to observe that you might meet as good fortune marrying on one Lady Day as another, a happy-go-lucky sentiment which Lisconnel appears disposed to adopt as a piece of local proverbial philosophy. Chapter 9. Backwards and Forwards. Should it be concluded from facts related in the foregoing chapters that truth for truth's sake is rather at a discount in Lisconnel, I can scarcely gainsay the inference. If letting on, romancing a bit, and just humbugging, with a little blarneying and sluthering thrown in, are overstraitly judged, we shall be found in a perilous state. But there is one point on which the veracity of its inhabitants, like that of many other people similarly situated, seems exposed to less warrantable suspicion. It is commonly received opinion that the dwellers in any remote and lonely district are largely responsible for whatever growths of ghostly legend may flourish there. These, although they do not perhaps spring directly from anybody's invention, are, it is held, sedulously fostered and cultivated, and handed down with additions and improvements from generation to generation, who take a sort of pride and pleasure in them. We have all heard how the peasants gather round their hearths on eerie winter evenings, and beguile the time with the recital of marrow-freezing ghost stories, to which they contribute, at any rate, wilfully credulous minds. No doubt this custom does really exist in some places, but I can confidently assert that it is not to be found in Lisconnel, and failing, personal observation, I should venture to think its general prevalence antecedently improbable. People who live their lives in solitary places of the earth, under a rigorous enforcement of all the penalties of Adam, are little likely to hanker after the introduction of any supernatural crooks into their lot, to voluntarily fill the wild blasts wailing round their poor hovels with unearthly shrieks and lamentations, that bid them spend their long night imagining some fear, or beset their fields with prowling phantoms that cause them on their lonely road to walk in doubt and dread. In Lisconnel certainly there is none of the vul d'échappée. On the contrary, such things are, if accepted at all, accepted under protest. There is a marked tendency to resist the admission of spectres to the hamlet and its purlieus, and to resent any obstinate assertion of their presence. Johnny Ryan, for instance, will fight you any day, supposing you a possible combatant, to uphold his contention that he never saw or heard aught on the bogland quare that it might be an old white goat glimmerin' in a stake of moonlight, or a saygull lettin' a screech goin' by. And a considerable ingenuity is expended in ephemerising uncanny personages and explaining away mysterious appearances. How much of whatever belief in spectral hauntings has survived these critical methods may be the unconscious work of imagination, on which opposition sometimes acts as a stimulus, is of course a different question. You have seen already some traces of its survival, and indeed if you consult a certain section of the community you will learn facts which you would, if I am not mistaken, be glad to disprove did you happen to live in Lisconnel. You will hear not only of fearsome wanderers met afield, but of strange forms found cowering by the hearth at home, and stealing away to lurk in dusky nooks, whence no one dares more than surmise their ultimate withdrawal. Of a shadow lying black all day across the threshold, with nothing visible to cast it, but falling ice cold upon whomsoever makes bold to step over it. Of a lame old woman who comes tapping at your door, it may be in the broad noonlight, a harmless seeming old creature you think, until she looks into your eyes and laughs a laugh you will not soon forget the sound of. All the lore, in short, connected with those beings whom Lisconnel terms collectively more or less under its breath, them wands. The origin of these visitations now lies obscured in the history of such old unhappy things, that it has come to be narrated in more various ways than I can here recount. But one of our local tragedies, said to be still terribly commemorated, did actually occur within the recollection of anybody who has had the sorrowful fortune to live through the Great Famine year, that is, some half-century since. It was down at Clayson's Boreen, a few miles along the road towards the town, where a skeleton cabin stands today, that a man, driven distraught with the famine fever, barred himself and 3 or 4 small children into their room while the mother went in quest of food, and when she returned with some bread at nightfall through the snow, the poor wretch would not open to her. So all night she beat on the door and called to her crying children, and the next day the whole family were found cold and dead, the father and children in the cabin, and the mother outside, half buried in a drift heaped against the wall, her loaf untouched, and in her hand the stone with which she had been battering the door. The cabin has been ever since deserted, and its doorstep is a ruinous gap. Yet still on many a night, they say, this miserable woman may be seen standing by it, wringing her hands and buffeting the empty air. If you can take to your heels and fly before you have beheld anything more, you will have met with nothing worse than a fright. But if she turns and beckons you to come and help her, you could be given no surer warning of black troubles in store. This is just what did befall Brian Kilfoyle one spring evening not long after young Dan's wedding, on his dusky way home from O'Byrne's forge with a mended loy. Brian's belief in ghostly manifestations is, as a rule, waveringly reluctant, and he would probably soon have reasoned himself into a conviction that he was only after mistaking something in the darkness of the light, had not his mood been already downcast and foreboding on account of his mother's failing health. For the past winter had proved a crucial test to all Lisconnel's feeble folk, and few of them had struggled through it unscathed. Some of them, indeed, had come out on the wrong, or at any rate the other side. The Pat Ryans had lost their youngest twin child, which was still of a size to be called by the neighbours indifferently Joe and Molly, and which used to trot a long way after either of its parents when it saw them going anywhere. Old Mick Ryan, too, had died at the end of several days' lethargy, so deep that it was impenetrable by even the tobacco to purchase which his daughter, elderly Biddy, ran into debt, besides nearly walking herself off her legs in a forced march to the town and back. Under these circumstances Brian was in the humour to take quick alarm at his mother's weakness and flagging spirits, and now his impression that the dark figure standing in the ruined doorway had turned round and beckoned to him through the twilight put a finishing touch to his uneasiness, so much so that he resolved upon the extreme measure of seeking qualified medical advice, and to that end obtained a red ticket from Father Rooney, whereupon to Lisconnel came, Dr. Ward being on leave, a youthful locum tenens whose amiable qualities created a favourable impression. His report upon his patient was to the effect that he could see little amiss with her. "Sure it's active and robustous enough your mother seems to be for a body of her time of life." He was thus represented as expressing himself by Mrs. Brian. "But in course it stands to reason she isn't altogether as young as she was a while ago." Not having a turn for obvious pleasantries, he had given up adding in such cases she ought to have plenty of strengthening food. "And goodness guide you, sir," says I to him, "sure she wasn't that afore ever you were born or thought of," says I, continued Mrs. Brian, who appeared somewhat illogically to consider this repartee a refutation of the doctor's cautiously worded statement. Her husband, on the other hand, felt by no means disposed to cavil at the verdict, which relieved his fears so happily that when he escorted the young man to his horse, he observed with strong emphasis, "It's real delightful weather we're gettin' now, your honour," although the bog was just then livid with low creeping flocks of pale mist, and the day had been as consistently dismal and lack-lustre a one as ever spent its drizzling hours in what we call neither raining nor letting it alone. The last Saturday in the following June was a shining contrast, a morning risen behind lattices of fretted snow sheen, which melted with ever widening interspaces, far up and away into faint lines and filmy streaks like the clouding on an agate, until, while the greensward underfoot was yet all beaded with prisms of dew, the lapis lazuli cup overhead curved down without a fleck from brim to brim. It was to be rather an eventful day for Lisconnel by reason of a fair held in the town, at which several of the neighbours proposed to sell their pigs and poultry. Lisconnel always sells its few pigs about this season, not because they are fat, but because the need of a little ready money becomes coercive in the month before potato digging. The place does not, I must admit, excel in swine, a fact hardly to be marvelled at when one considers how much plain living is perforce practised by the animals during their sojourn among us, even if it is accompanied by a corresponding high thinking, which must remain a matter of conjecture, that does not influence market prices. Seldom in the case of a Lisconnel pig will any amount of hopeful prodding and poking establish in its owner's mind a comfortable assurance of good condition, though a refractory beast, who has to be hauled shrieking out of a hole or lifted over a dyke, is conventionally described as the weight of any 10 begorra. Yet however humble our own opinion of our wares may be, it is trying to find the same confirmed for us sarcastically by other people. We do not like to be greeted after a long trudge by inquiries such as, "Wasn't it maybe a coursing match you were intendin' to show them at all the while?" Or, "Might you ever ha' happened to take notice that in some places the pigs do have a fashion of wearing their bones on the wrong side of their skins?" Or, "What at all do you be feedin' the beasts on up at Lisconnel? Old scythe blades belike? Or is it an odd taste of a slim-handled hay-rake?" These questions have before now been settled temporarily with the help of fists and blackthorns. The market folk set off betimes this morning, and as many of their neighbours were out on the bog cutting turf, the place grew very quiet. When once the squealing and squawking which attended their progress had died distantly away, it felt like a Sunday to the stayers at home, and it was partly this, and partly the glorious weather, that brought them together in a session on an undulating bank of fine sward interspersed with boulders set flat in heathery rims, a favourite holiday lounging place not far from the Kilfoyles' cabin. Old Mrs. Kilfoyle was among them, brisker again in response to the call of June, but physically almost extinguished under the folds of her daughter-in-law's ample blue cloak, with which her winter's indisposition had been made a long-sought pretext for investing her, much against her will. Even Peter Sheridan made a shift to hobble out of doors, not leaving behind him his rheumatics, and bade scran to them, whose companionship is, however, least obtrusive when he can sit quiet in the warm clasp of the sun. Its beams came along and slanting still when the two last of the party bound for the fair were almost ready to start, the widow M'Gurk and Brian Kilfoyle. Brian was going as a buyer, not a seller, having disposed of his pig a week ago, when, finding that small pigs went cruel dear, he deferred the purchase of its successor in hopes to getting a better bargain later on. But the widow had on her hands both her pig and a clocking hen, with which, a clutch of eggs being unattainable, she had regretfully resolved to part. Brian had waited to assist her in the transportation of this live stock, but the hen, with a perverse prescience characteristic of her race, had at the last moment taken ungainly flight, and was now being pursued by himself and all the children out of arms. Meanwhile Mrs. M'Gurk, ready equipped for her journey, paused by the wayside group with her lean pig in a string. "We do right to leave that old rogue of a hen behind us," she said uneasily, while her beast fell to grazing industriously, as if bent upon adding at least a shilling to his market value. "She'll only be delayin' the man and spoilin' of his chances." "Och, they'll grab her prisintly, no fear. She can't keep that work up very long, try her best," said old Mrs. Kilfoyle, placidly listening to the receding sounds of the pursuit. "Sit you down, Mrs. M'Gurk, ma'am, and be taking the weight off your feet while you can. I hope you'll have good luck with that creature there. He seems to be a tidy level little beast." "I wish I may do as well as Brian himself done last day wid his," said the widow. "'Twas a grand price entirely he got out of them, and if he can pick up a weeny one anyways raisonable, he'll be right enough, please God." And we've a notion what else he'll be bringing home wid him this evening over and above, haven't we now, Mrs. Ryan?" she added, glancing at Mrs. Kilfoyle and winking with weather-beaten archness. "Troth have we," said Judy Ryan, "the same sort of notion I've got of what Mr. Core does be weighin' out of a yellow papered box with black scrawms on it, and charges 8p the quarther pound for, and blows open a purple bag to put it in. And then if your kettle's boilin' and your water's not smoked, 'twill be yourself's to blame if you haven't an illigant cup of tay." Judy was happily unconscious that the end of her enigma had escaped rather prematurely from its subtle unfolders. "Aye, aye," said the little old woman, looking round her from friendly face to face in a pleased flutter. "Brian does be very good." And everybody smiled and winked and nodded approval, being fully in the secret of Brian's intentions. Everybody except Biddy Sheridan, who looked suddenly disconsolate, as if at a pang of jarred memory, where she sat peeling flakes of shaggy grey lichen off a sun-warmed stone. "Me brother Mick," she said in a semi-soliloquising murmur, "he very belike ha' been thinkin' of bringin' home a bit of baccy this night wid him too, if there was e'er a one left to set store by it. Mick never begrudged aught he could do for his old father, I'll say that for him. It wasn't in him, not when he had his own way." There was just a tinge of resentment in the last words. "And bedad now, Biddy," her sister-in-law's tone was undisguisedly deprecating, "bedad now, woman alive, nobody could lay it agin us that we either of us iver begrudged the poor old man, God be good to him, bit or sup, or any trifle of warmth or comfort we had the givin' of. I'm not goin' for deny that I might be a bit put past me patience, goodness forgive me, now and agin, when times was bad, to see his old pipe puffin'. 'Twas in a way like throwin' the childer's scrap of food behind the fire." "Accordin' to my considerin'," Mrs. Kilfoyle's falsetto flute piping interposed before Biddy could reply, "that baccy's a humbuggin' kind of ould stuff. Sure that's plain on the face of it, for except it was lettin' on to be somethin' different from itself, who'd give a brass farthin' for the likes of it? A little black-lookin' lump you've as much botheration gettin' a smoulder of red out of it as if it was a wet sod of turf and risin' such a smell. Faix, you might think they'd a cartload of pratie halms burnin' in the pipe bowl. Only I'd a deal liefer have that for a scent, och, but I remember it in the fields at home. But the fact of the matter is, smokin's just a notion the crathurs have. When they get taken up wid it, 'tis the same to them as a peaceable sort of drunkenness, and puts the thought of the troubles they're in the middle of out of their heads. Many's the time I'd think of meself, Biddy, when I'd see your poor father sittin' inside there wid his feet in a puddle of rain, and the cold wind freezin' mad, and he lookin' fit to drop, and he contented himself all the while wid the old pipe that was near shakin' out of his hand, the creature. Many's the time I'd be thinkin' 'tis a poor case to have nothin' between yourself and all the divil's work about you better than a few streels of baccy smoke. Och, girl, we've no call to go wish any one back agin widin his reach, that's after givin' him the slip for good and all, and needn't be schamin' ways to disremember himself and his tormentin' tricks." "That's the truth, ma'am," said Peter Sheridan hoarsely at her elbow. "I dunno, then," said Mrs. M'Gurk, who stood fronting the assembly, with her elongated shadow grotesquely deflected against the sunny bank, and who evidently entered her protest from the sense of duty. "I dunno how you're rightified in makin' sure you'll be shut of the devil as soon as you quit out of this, be any manner of means. Bedad, it may be quite the other way. My opinion of him is, you never can tell where he'll have you, dead or alive. For anything we know, he might be doin' as much agin us one place as the other, or maybe more, and bad luck to him." "Well, it's clear enough to me," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "and the way I look at it is this. There's little misdoubtin' that the divil's plinty of since, however he came by it, and knows what he's about, God forgive him, as well as you or me. And he wouldn't be distressin' himself the way he is to keep annoyin' people if he didn't perceive that it was here he's gettin' his best chanst of doin' mischief on us, and nowhere else. He wouldn't give himself that much trouble, you may depind, if he thought he'd have us readier to his hand, merely be waitin' till the breath was out of one's body. Not he. He's too cute. For look at the carryin's on of him. Look at the contrivances he has, and the inventions. Sure there's nothin' big or little he wouldn't be for meddlin' in, though it might be a matter you'd never think he'd need to concern himself wid, except he was fairly druv to it. Even so, he hasn't it all his own way, for whenever his betters have the time, now and again, to be keepin' an eye on him, he's bound to quit interferin', and iverything goes pleasant enough, and no thanks to him, I bedad, he gets a disappointment of an odd while like any one else in this world. And mark my words, he wouldn't be spendin' so much of his days in it if there was e'er another place he could regulate more to his mind." "Unless 'twas for diversion like," suggested Judy Ryan, "the same way that quality do come straightin' on the bog wid their guns, and wadin' up to their knees in the rivers after the bits of birds and fish, and they wid more than they can ate at home all the while, if it was that ailed them." "Diversion? Why, woman dear, in course it's diversion to him. What else should it be? But what I was sayin' is that it's here he has to come for it, same as quality after their shootin'. And when wunst we've took off wid ourselves, he's no more chanst agin us than they have at a flock of snipe they're after missin' and scarin'. And, signs on it, he's no ways wishful to be seein' folk he's plaguin' quit. If it's a young body now that's to be took, a bit of a child or a fine lad, who'll have plenty breaking their hearts after them, that belike suits the old nagur right well. He's nothin' to say agin it. They'll go fast enough. But there's a many misfortunate creature that unless the divil does his endeavours to keep them alive in their misery, I dunno who would." "True for you, ma'am," said Peter Sheridan again. "You might say so if you'd whiles feel the life was skivered into your body wid all the sharp ends of aches and pains, or else you'd be fit to stretch yourself out easy, and away wid you." "Do not say such a thing then, father," said his daughter Peg, looking piteously at him, and all at once feeling like a parricide, as she bethought her how she had only last night assented to her stepmother's proposition that himself was getting uglier tempered with every day went over his head. "But he's bound to let go a hould of you one time or another, Peter, please God," Mrs. Kilfoyle urged consolatorily. "Whatever villainy he does on you, the end of it is he has to give it up at a bad job and leave you to go along and pace." "Arrah, now, will no talk content you but dyin' and the devil," remonstrated Mrs. Doyne. "To be hearin' you, one 'ud think we were just sittin' here a minute to wait till our coffins come up the road that the ould wan had the bespaking of." She glanced furtively round the broad skyscape, and then huddled herself closer into the shelter of the hollow bank, tightening her skimpy shawl across her shoulders. "Sure I was meanin' no harm wid it," said the old woman apologetically, "but we might easy wisht about him for that matter. There's a good few things the divil has nothin' to say to, or dyin' either, though I dunno why people need mostly think so bad of that. It's maybe the sort of trouble there is shiftin' from one place to another that sets them agin it." "Aye," said Mrs. Quigley, "some botheration there's apt to be gettin' in and out of anything, if it's only elbowing your way out of chapel when there's a throng at Mass. and 'twill be right at the door you'll get the most crowdin' and pushin' and squeezin', fit to reive the ould rags off of your back. But just the next step beyond it, you're all the world clear before you, and room to be dancin' jigs in, if that was what you were after." "Crowdin', is it?" said Biddy Ryan. "Ah, jabbers, there's no crowdin' about it that I can see. Musha, it's part of the contrariness of the whole concern, that so long as you keep livin', there'll be people all about you galore, day out and day in, wid the childer bawlin' and screechin', and the lads quarrellin' and bangin' about, and everything all through other under your feet, till you're fairly moided, and thinkin' you'd be glad enough to find e'er a little hole away off be yourself for peace and quiet. But when you come to quittin' them all, and takin' off to nobody can rightly tell where, and you feelin' that quare and lost, you'd be ready to put up wid any company you could get, if it was only a brute baste. Och, then there's never a soul you'll have a chanst of along wid you, sorra a mortal one. Lonesome or no lonesome, it's be yourself you're bound to go." "That's the notion young people like you do have," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, who remembered Biddy's grizzled locks on a downy fluff. "But be the time you've lived as long as I, and seen as many comin' and goin' and stayin' away, you'll find it's behind you that you're leavin' the most of the lonesomeness. Seems to me 'twould have saved a power of work if Almighty God would ha' been content to make the one job of it, and stick us all down wherever it was we were meant to stop, widout any shiftin' us back and forwards," said Annie Sheridan, who had come up with a large turf creel on his shoulders, and crouching under it on the top of the bank had somewhat the aspect of a straity lodged hermit crab. "It's the same as if you were to be plantin' your pitaties in half a dozen different places before you'd made your mind up to the right one, and that's a quare way of doin' business." "Perhaps you've no call to be in a hurry, me tight lad, to find yourself settled in a place you're bound for," quoth Mrs. M'Gurk grimly, for Andy was not in her good graces. "Maybe not," he said, undoubling himself to aim a conjectural cuff at his half-sister Rose, whom he heard trying to tilt over his creel from behind. "But whether or no, where's the sinse of it?" "Well, sure, for one thing, if people were to have been always in the good place, they mightn't ever know the differ," said Judy Ryan, coming in first, while her neighbours was still casting about for hypotheses. "And supposin'," said Andy, swinging his legs unimpressed, "where'd be the harm of not knowin' the differ, when there was nary a differ to know?" Judy was not prepared to elucidate this point, and looked her perplexity. "Who said there was any sense in it?" demanded Peter Sheridan glumly. "As like as not there's none." He was staring straight before him, seemingly in at the black doorway, not many paces distant, out of which he had painfully crawled. "Ah, now, I declare I dare say that's it, glory be to goodness," said Judy, brightening up as if piously relieved at this solution of the difficulty. "Very belike there's no sense in it at all. It's just the will of God." "And we needn't be concernin' ourselves about that anyhow," said Mrs. Quigley. "Eh, lads dear, we'll all git sorted right enough one way or the other," Mrs. Kilfoyle said, summing up rather hurriedly, for it struck her that the discussion was developing a note of acrimony. "We're better off at all evints than if we were to be beginnin' wid the good and endin' wid the bad. And here's Brian after catchin' the ould hin." "Bad manners to her, then, be givin' him such a dance," said Mrs. M'Gurk. Brian had his captive in a dishevelled wicker basket, from beneath the wobbling lid of which she frequently thrust her witless black head to squawk, at an imminent risk of guillotining, since he suppressed her demonstrations as promptly as if they had been applause in a court of justice. "Begorra, ma'am," he said, "if there was anybody down beyant offerin' a stiff price for a sort of ould screech owl wid springs in the legs of her like a grasshopper's, when she's tired flyin' up over your head like an eagle, you've a right to make your fortune this day. It's lucky I thought to give Norah the handkerchy wid the bit of money in it afore she went on, for afraid it might get joggled out of me somehow shankin' down. But it's steppin' we ought to be. Goodbye to you kindly, mother, and keep us a sup of hot water boilin'." The widow twitched away her pig from his grazing, which caused him to exchange his appreciative harumphs for Protestant squeals, and they were all three soon out of sight behind the ridge of the Knockawn. "They'll be no great while overtaking the others at that gait of goin'," said Biddy Ryan. "Och, but 'tis a long draggin' stretch of road, weary on it, and lengthens itself out ivery time you go it. But there's none of us will have tramped it as often as yourself, Mrs. Kilfoyle, ma'am." "Belike no, me dear," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, "considerin' all the years' start I've had of the whole of yous. Sure I was no age at all, you may say, when first we travelled it. This end of it wasn't rightly finished. Faith, Lisconnel was but a poor lookin' place in those days, and for a while after we did be livin' here, we always called it the road home, because 'twas along it we came out of the old place in the County Clare. Then if we wanted to keep the childer pacified, that was mostly small rampagin' spalpeens, we'd only to let on we were settin' out back again, and they'd trot along till they were tired. But the day me father was buried down beyant, nothing we could do or say 'ud persuade the crathurs that he hadn't just gone home to fetch our couple of cows. 'Deed, poor man, he fretted terrible about the little black Kerry he left behind. Rosine Dhu, he called her, and they did be lookin' out a great while expectin' him to come drivin' her along. Do you see the white stone, Biddy, up there agin the edge of the headland? That's where little Thady, me youngest brother, 'ud sit watchin' many a day, and had me poor mother distracted, more betoken, wid runnin' tumblin' in to see her like a bit of a puppy, yellin' that his father was comin' up the road. It's a quare imp of a child, Thady was, that went to the mackerel fishin', and was drowned in Galway Bay." "I just can mind hearin' talk of Thady Joyce," said Peter Sheridan, "but troth, you'll git ahead backwards of the whole of us, ma'am, when it's a matter of recollections." "Yit for as long as I'm in Lisconnel," Mrs. Kilfoyle said meditatively, "I scarce think I've ever got the idea of it all clear in me head the same way I have the old place at home. It doesn't seem that natural to me somehow. Leastways these times when I don't be traipsin' about much, the lie of the land gets moided up in me mind as if 'twas wid a mist risin'. But Clonmena now, sure to this day if I'm lyin' awake in the night, I can be goin' over the whole of it, lighted up in me thoughts, same as I used to, and I a slip of a lass sleepin' in the bit of a room away under the thatch, lookin' out above the front door, wid the river runnin' by. Sure I knew every inch of ground it flowed over, and whilst afore I fall asleep I divert myself, threadin' the fields and all along it, as if you were slippin' your beads through your fingers. First it's in our couple of fields that's the one of them narther and long shaped, and the other of them scooped out hollow and round like a sort of nest, and the both of them as smooth and as green as the moss shining in the cracks of this old stone. And then across the end of young Conroy's meadow below the high bank and the hawthorns atop, and after that off wid it under the dark bridge on the Borisk road, and spreadin' out on the grey gravel beds and among the clumps of cress. 'Tis but a poor hungry bit of land, all tussocks and ragweed, till it runs round the hill foot among the firs, and gets slitherin' away down and down past the smothered stones and the brown roots, and the fern leaves drippin', and the stems tumblin' aslant, makin' for the bottom of the deep glen. And in there it does be shut close, wid the trees roofin' it overhead, and the little path wavin' up and down alongside it all the way to the old mill at Kildrum. So a bit beyond it, it takes out into the river Coolanaw, no less. That's a powerful width of water. Saints alive, sure I could be following it along blindfold. Or if it was the wind I heard comin' rustlin' by the other way, I could tell where it was goin' wid itself, keenin' up the boreen behind the house and out on the big, steep pitaty field, and beyond that again, over the grass slopes and the sheep browsin' and the breadth of bracken and furze bushes, till the great cliffs go down at your feet slap into the sea like the wall of a church tower. When you look over the edge you might think there was the white wing of a gull just fluttering at the bottom, but musha, all the while it's the foam of a big wave rolled in fit to lift you off your 2 feet, supposing you were anywheres it could get a grab at you. You'll hear the sound of them comin' up ivery once in a while, like as if 'twas the river stoppin' to take breath. But it's the flow of the river I do be missin' most out of it, these times when I'm rememberin' it to meself. I've a notion I'd get a great weep entirely if ever I come widin sound of it again, for 'twas the last thing I'd mind afore I dropped off, and as like as not the first thing I'd hear in the mornin' would be our creatures of ducks flusterin' into it one after the other off of the flat steppin' stone, and I'd up wid me and out to see to gettin' in the eggs. Goodness guide me, 'twas only the other day, wakin' up, I thought I heard me poor mother callin' "Chooky, chooky" to her hens as natural as could be, and it just Mrs. Pat huntin' home her little goat. I dunno what ud romancin' I have," said Mrs. Kilfoyle, interrupting herself, "but this while back I've nothin' only them far gone days runnin' in me mind. Seems like as if there must be somethin' real quare ahead of me that hinders me thinkin' forwards." End of section 7.